President, I'm proud to stand today in support of Scott Pruitt, President Trump's nominee to head the Environmental Protection Agency. I can think of no one who is better suited or more fully qualified to lead this agency and to advance within it the reforms it so desperately needs. I look forward to voting to confirm Mr. Pruitt as EPA Administrator, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. In many ways, the EPA epitomizes the broken status quo in Washington, a status quo that is increasingly and rightly viewed with suspicion and a certain amount of contempt by the American people. That broken, discredited status quo has been described in various ways: out of touch, arbitrary, inflexible, unreasonable, heavy-handed, unaccountable. These words could apply to any number of institutions or offices here in Washington, D.C. But they're the hallmarks of the rule-writing departments that make up our federal bureaucracy. Technically, these bureaucratic agencies are creatures of the executive branch, creatures that exist to assist the president in fulfilling his constitutional duty to take care that the laws written by the legislative branch are to be faithfully executed. But over the past several decades, they've been recast as the federal government's center of gravity, both writing and enforcing, and in many cases even interpreting the vast majority of laws governing America's society and America's economy. Elevating the unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy to the driver's seat of the federal government, to the driver's seat specifically of federal policymaking, is mostly the work of members of Congress, of both chambers and of both political parties, who understand that the best way to avoid being blamed by voters for unpopular laws is not to make them, at least not to make them completely, but rather to empower unelected bureaucrats to make the laws for them. But the regulatory agencies themselves sometimes deserve some of the blame as well. Congress is guilty of writing laws that are couched in vague terms, centered around gauzy goals, instead of strictly defined and understandable rules. But federal regulators are guilty of interpreting and repeatedly reinterpreting those laws in order to accommodate their ever-expanding conception of their own power, of their own authority to work their own will on the American people. For instance, in the years since Congress passed the Clean Air Act amendments in 1977, federal bureaucrats have used the law to enact more than 13,500 pages of regulations, which works out to roughly 30 pages of regulations for every 1 page of underlying legislative text. Mr. President, the fundamental problem with this expansion and centralization of regulatory authority is the tendency of Washington, D.C. bureaucrats to be ignorant of, and often very indifferent to, the interests of the people who live in the various communities that are affected by the rules they make and the rules that they also enforce. This isn't a knock on the individual men and women who work within the federal bureaucracy, most of whom are well-educated, well-intentioned, and highly specialized. But there's no doubt that a regulator in Washington, D.C. knows a whole lot less about a melon farm in Emery County, Utah, and cares a lot less about the fate of the people who work at that melon farm in Emery County, Utah, than would a regulator, say, in Salt Lake City. The Environmental Protection Agency, in particular, is notorious for its top-down, Washington-knows-best approach to regulation, which often runs roughshod over the immense diversity of local circumstances in our large country. Too often, the EPA treats states and state regulators not as partners, but as adversaries. It treats the states themselves not as laboratories of Republican democracy, but rather as lab rats to be tested upon for their own amusement and for the exertion of their own political power. Scott Pruitt understands this well because he has seen it firsthand. As Attorney General of Oklahoma, Mr. Pruitt has spent many years being ignored and pushed around by Washington, an experience that has taught him the need for the EPA to work with and not condescend to the states. In his Senate confirmation hearing, Mr. Pruitt explained why improving the relationship between the EPA and state-level regulators is the best way to protect our environment and uphold the separation of powers. That is the cornerstone of our constitutional system. He said, quote, "Cooperative federalism is at the heart of many of the environmental statutes that involve the Environmental Protection Agency. The reason for that is that it's the states that many times have the resources, the expertise, and an understanding of the unique challenges of protecting our environment and improving our water and our air. We need a partnership, a true partnership between the EPA in performing its role, along with the states in performing theirs. And if we have that partnership, as opposed to punishment, as opposed to uncertainty and duress that we currently see in the marketplace, I think we'll have better air and better water quality as a result." Mr. President, for many Americans, and certainly for many of my fellow Utahns, the EPA is a pejorative. It's synonymous with an out-of-touch and out-of-control federal government. This is a shame. Americans want, and Americans certainly deserve, clean air and clean water. And the EPA has the potential to help them achieve these goals. But only if the EPA itself returns to its core mission and works well, works wisely to accomplish that mission, works within our constitutional system. And that's why I'm so pleased that Scott Pruitt is on his way to lead the EPA. The agency exists to protect the American people, not advance the narrow agenda of some special interests while punishing others. I'm confident that Mr. Pruitt is the right man for the job and that he'll remain independent while correcting the troubling course that the EPA has taken in recent decades. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.